Start. Good morning, dear friends and colleagues, for the third day of our conference on potential spaces. I did not really have the chance yesterday to thank all the wonderful panelists, speakers, and those who were involved in the discussions. I must say I have learned a lot, and this is the maximum what you can get out of a conference. Of course, consciously we called this meeting or this gathering potential spaces. We wanted to create an open space for various discussions, and when you invite people from so many different backgrounds, perspectives, and cultures and regions, of course it's absolutely nonsense to hope that you can somehow generate a concept in the sense of a begriff, of an abstraction which everything can include within a short time and within some short-circuit thinking. As we are doing here, or at least try to do at a university like the University of Arts and Design, we are trying to celebrate heterogeneities every day. We have a very interdisciplinary construction in the way we are studying here and researching and learning, and we hope, of course, that you all enjoy the heterogeneity of the different perspectives which had been discussed yesterday. From Gao Ximing's manifesto yesterday morning to Julian Oliver's critical engineering, there was a wide span. On the other hand, there were very, very strong proximities in thinking and in conceptualizing the way how you can work with the interrelations of art sciences and technology. The same, I think, for Irit Rogov's access, which was focusing on this open workshop idea in Bergen and the consequences she was drawing out of that. I think, for me at least, it was there were strong vibrations between the ideas we have then seen in the C&D project, the online project on contemporary arts with focuses on African artists, and the Fendi workshop culture. We have been traveling from China to Africa, from New Zealand to Europe. Today we are traveling to the Near East, to Lebanon, hopefully, at least virtually, and then to Palestine, to Australia, to Hungary, to Colombia, to Spain, finally, to China again. This will be the end tonight, and we're all looking forward to the Confucius Rights projects with Jeffrey Shaw, Johnson Tsang, and discussing with us Li Shenghua. We are a little bit irritated and nervous. There is nothing less reliable than telecommunications, as we have witnessed already last night. I think it was Guy Debord who said telecommunication is connecting, but it's only existing because we are separated. And now we are trying to get a connection with Angela in Beirut. And she obviously mixed up the time, so it might be possible that we have the connection an hour later. So we start with Kamal Aljafari, who will in a second be introduced by Anja Dorn. My pleasure is now to introduce quickly Anja Dorn. You heard her already a few times speaking during the conference. I'm very grateful, Anja, that you took over this task to navigate us in this area, which is not so easy to overview at the moment. Anja Dorn is Professor for Curatorial Theory and Dramaturgical Praxis at our University of Arts and Design. She studied art history, theater and film studies, and economy in Cologne and in Florence, and curatorial training and praxis in Amsterdam. I know her work before I came to Cologne very well from to Karlsruhe, sorry, before I left Cologne, going to Berlin, because between 2007 and 2011, Anja was together with Katrin Jentjens, director of the very prestigious Cologne Kunstverein, Kölnischer Kunstverein. For those of you who are not familiar with these institutions in Germany, especially the Cologne Kunstverein was extremely important for developing the, let's say, contemporary avant-garde art movements around media art. It was always a wonderful place for us at the Academy in Cologne to cooperate with, and as far as I remember, there was also a cooperation already between Kamal and Anja during that time in Cologne. The Kölnischer Kunstverein did many exhibitions during the period when Anja was there between 2007 and 2011 with different single artists. Amongst them was also Omar Fast, who is now professor here at our university, and many others. I don't want to give you the whole list: Seth Price, Stephen Preiner, and many others. She also made interesting thematical group exhibitions during this time in Cologne. I translate, hopefully, the titles of some of them for you. Concepts of Love, this was 2008. Lecture of Performance, this was 2009. And Anja obviously circles around this strange term, love. Forbidden Love in 2010. These are three of these group exhibition projects. She also worked for at least 4 or 5 years in a room which was for young artists extremely important, in a space, one should say, perhaps better, which was called Project Room in Cologne. Pardon? April. Ah, okay. And which offered a lot of intellectual and artistic spaces, free space for discussions, for discourse, and of course for art practices. Please welcome Anja, and I ask Anja to take over the podium now. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this wide introduction to me, Siegfried Zielinski. It's wonderful that you all came on this Saturday morning so early. And today in the morning, in the panel that we'll have here, I'm very lucky because there'll be different perspectives that really surround spaces and potential spaces. And which is nice also after yesterday, where we saw in all the different lectures, especially with Gao Ximing and Irit Rogov, how what one could maybe answer Hans Belting's question, that it is, and also in reaction to Nikos Papastigiadis' idea of the expanded field, that maybe one could define art maybe today more through a practice, through an activity, and that is producing art. And then that in this field, maybe it's not so important what is art and what is more design, or what is just a kind of practice, as Gao Ximing also pointed out. But still, within the field, there is another activity, and that is the one of aesthetic experience, where you could say and point very clearly, this now is art and not just artistic practice. So that I found really interesting, because it got so clear through all the different kinds of practices that we've seen, and that are so important also for the concept of the school, which is dealing with, as Siegfried Zielinski just said, with science, design, and art. Okay. So today we'll come to these potential spaces, and in some way, of course, it resounds the idea of sense of possibilities of that Robert Musil was talking about already in the 1930s. It's a term that he uses in his novel Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, The Man Without Characters. How is it translated? How is it translated? Do you know? Qualities. Yeah. So this sense of possibility does not deny the reality and the facts, but does construct an alternative relation to them, an alternative in which aims and ways are multiplicated, spinning off unordered. And I think that is a nice starting point for today. We will now first hear Kamal Aljafari, whom I know from Cologne, where he had also a studio space at the Kunstverein before I've been working there. And Kamal, I'll say that because it is in some way relevant for his work, I think, was born in Ramle in Israel and is now living in Berlin. And he graduated of the Academy of Media Arts in Cologne, I think in 2006, and produced many films. His films include The Roof from 2006, which won the Best International Award of the Image Festival in Toronto, and also the Best Soundtrack at Film Marseille, and The Port of Memory of 2009. Many of his films circle around his hometown or places in Palestine, and which we will also see today. Kamal also taught and has been a lot in the USA, where he has been featured artist at the 2009 Robert Flaherty Film Seminar in New York, and then he was Whitney Fellow at Harvard University, and he taught film at the New School in New York between 2011 and 2013. Ist das richtig? Nein. The time is wrong. I am sorry. In 2010 he did that. Today we'll see Recollection, a film by Kamal that he produced in 2015. It was premiered at the Locarno Film Festival. And Kamal, please come.
Thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you, Zielinski, for this wonderful invitation to reconnect again and see old friends, Anya, Ludmila, Eko, people that I met in my time in Cologne, and to meet new friends. So the theme of the conference is very much at the heart of what I have been working on since many years already. Namely cinema as a country in the Adornian sense. I grew up I was born in Ramle in Israel, but I grew up in Jaffa. And one of my strong memories as a child was one day I was walking back from school to my grandmother's house, and I see a group of children gathered, very excited. So I stood next to them, and they were all mentioning a name of someone I never heard before, Chuck Norris. So I waited, and I see this blonde man with M16 riding a Volkswagen car with an open door, and this car had the name of my school over it because the film producer simply copied things that existed in the town. And he opens the door and he starts shooting everywhere. So many years later, in 2009, I was visiting London, and I enter my hotel room, and you have this welcoming sentence on the TV, "Welcome, Mr. Kamal Aljafari." So I changed this channel, and I went to take a shower. I went out of the shower, and I see the exact scene of Chuck Norris shooting in the streets of Jaffa. So I sat down on the bed and I watched this film. And this was the first time I watched this film that I witnessed the shooting of in the mid-80s. I was very disturbed by watching this film because in this film, like many of the action American films set in the Middle East, it's a very typical story of American hostages being held by Lebanese terrorists. And in this case, Jaffa was used as Beirut during the Civil War. And Chuck Norris and his Delta Force, this is the title of the film as well, Delta Force 1, because there was Delta Force 2 and 3. He eventually frees these hostages from a school where they were held. And the final scene of the film was actually the explosion of this building after they freed the hostages. Now, during the shooting of this film, this was basically a real-time explosion. Back then, the municipality of Tel Aviv gave the film producer a free hand to use empty buildings in the city, in Jaffa. So basically, after the shooting of this scene, this building didn't exist anymore. Basically, using a real explosion and producing cinematic violence. So while I was watching this film, I was all the time trying to have a better view of the background, and the actors who were standing in the foreground, they were blocking my way. Because the city, as you see it in the film, doesn't exist anymore because it got systematically destroyed. So in that sense, this same film, which actually took part in the destruction of the city, ironically, was the only documentation left for me to go back to this place. So I had this idea to remove the actors from this film and from many other films which were shot in Jaffa throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, fiction films. And I started doing this research where I was looking for these films. And I say fiction films because I was more interested in what was being captured unintentionally in the background of these films. So I gathered something like 50 films which were shot in Jaffa, where I could see the city, reconstruct the city in my mind first. And I projected these films in the cinema, and I started the process of taking pictures as if this place doesn't exist anymore, and I'm a tourist actually looking at the place, looking at Jaffa in this case, and taking pictures. So I produced roughly 20,000 images, and then I started in the process of removing the actors and creating a new camera work, animated camera work in the background, basically making a new film about someone who has the ability to visit all the places which don't exist anymore and rebuild the city in his mind. So it's basically a film about someone dreaming, and in his dream he is filming. But I would say that it's not a national film, because my interest wasn't only to rebuild the city. I would even say that it's, for me, it has been always a Zebeldian film about all the catastrophized places, whether today Aleppo, Berlin in the past, place where I live now. And I would like just to read a couple of things, thoughts that I would love to share with you about the work. Afterwards, we're gonna screen part of it. So the character in this film is dreaming, and in his dream, he is filming. He is returning to Jaffa as he might to any catastrophized place. In that sense, it was always a film for me making itself. It was memory filming itself, the memory of all the backgrounds it rescued from the screen. We hear his footsteps. Later, he begins to hear voices. He sees where the quarter on the sea used to be, the life buried there speaking to itself, or overhearing, no wiser than we, as to where snatches of voices or music are coming from. It is the sound of after catastrophe. At times, he loses himself. He hears the rain, but doesn't see it. He is jet-lagged by some 70 years, a jet-lag he will never overcome, nor will anyone, but in time. So this character has the ability to film the past. He is the ability of cinema to dissolve borders. I removed the actors simply because they stood in my way, technically speaking. As in a dream, the search for answers cannot provide any. What there is what one sees. To bend everything together in meaning is the antithesis of what this dream does. The only person he speaks to is a girl who doesn't help him to understand anything, but only confirms that he is somewhere he can no longer recognize. There is no Tel Aviv, there is no Jaffa, there is only one place now called Nahal-Oz. He opens the door. A man is beating up a puppet. The nonsensical violence that can only ever fail. It's not a film from there. It is a post-catastrophe film, a film about all the ruined cities, Aleppo, Detroit, Berlin. Let it be any catastrophized place, any place where fiction films were shot and where the camera ate the place that it shot alive. That's it, actually. So we will screen the part of the film, because the film is 70 minutes long. It's too long for you to watch now in the morning. And we can talk about it later. Thank you. with no sound.
Thank you very much, Kamal, for this beautiful film. I thought that maybe we speak a bit about what you were doing within the film before we open the discussion. And I mean, one thing that I found really interesting, also knowing some of your other films, is that your films often live from the long duration, but it is more like a very patient and tender look at things, at spaces and actions of people around you, really on what they actually do with their hands and their bodies, more than about persons, I find even. And what I find interesting now is that you work with images and not with spaces or bodies. And could you explain us a bit what you do? I mean, because the material that we saw was all from the Chuck Norris film, right?
No, not only.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
the Chuck Norris film was one of the films. For the making of this film, I used roughly 50 different films. As I mentioned before, there were Israeli fiction films shot in Jaffa throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in these films, they were all shot in Jaffa. This was the concept I had. I'm going to use only images shot in Jaffa. And in these fiction films, the Palestinians didn't exist at all.
So what were they about then?
They were actually quite, many of them were comedies, musicals, made in 60s and 70s, mostly about the impossible relationship between the Mizrahi Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews. Most of these films were about an impossible love story between a Moroccan Jew, who's usually a criminal, a thug, in these films, and he's in love, or a Polish Jew is in love with him, and it's about this conflict between the two parts of the Israeli society, which was in creation in the 50s and 60s. Basically films about the gathering of exiles of Israelis now living in Jaffa. And I guess Jaffa was very practical because it could provide the filmmakers with narrative and with history. Because if you had shot these same films in Tel Aviv is a new city. And Jaffa is an old city, which means that you have history there, you have narrative in this place. So these films were shot, they were made, and finally in the 80s, one of the big actually producers of these films were Menachem Golan. Some of you probably know the name. And he was the one who finally started making war films in Jaffa. So first Jaffa was used as a location to provide the filmmakers with a narrative, and then it was actually finally destroyed. The image you see in my film of the explosion, it's the one I mentioned before, of the empty school which was used in Delta Force. So, yeah, Delta Force was one of the films, of many films. So I basically, my idea, I felt really responsible to make this film because there was a sense of, if you want, a cinematic injustice which took place there towards the city and towards the people who were actually in the background of these films. Because when I started working on the project, I didn't see them. I was looking only for the city and trying to kind of reconstruct some of the places I knew from my childhood and visit other places which I haven't seen before, and I could see them only in the fiction films. But in the process itself, I started noticing people in the background who were not part of the original narrative of the films. The first one was, actually, before noticing people, I started noticing faces engraved on stone. like the one I don't know if you remember, there was this zoom in that the camera is doing. Now, all this zooming in and panning, this is something I have done in the computer. I mean, there's nothing in this film which was taken as it is from the original films. So the film is made mostly with stills that I animated to have the feeling that this person is walking inside the image.
And it's moving around. So what you did in a very artificial and I suppose very tiring process was to animate a hand camera actually
exactly,
walking through the space.
So, like, and not only that, this person, he is a photographer, he has a style. So I just took a data of a pan, a data of walking, and developed a style for this person who you never see. You just feel him walking and he is filming. So, and again, what I mentioned before, it is this person dreaming because all these places actually in reality don't exist anymore.
So, and what did you do with the sound? Because I was wondering, for example, with the sound of the rain, was it a sound that that actually comes from Jaffa? I mean, I was wondering what rain it is.
Precisely, this was storm and rain from Berlin, because there were two levels actually in the sound. So I had this idea, since this person dreaming, he must be dreaming somewhere, he must be sleeping somewhere. So I recorded myself dreaming, sleeping, sleeping in my bedroom in Berlin. And it was a very bad recording because I was moving too much in the bed. So I left the mic and I slept somewhere else. And I did this recording of my bedroom for like 7 hours. Which was quite fascinating because we know nothing about what's happening while we are sleeping. So there were all these noises coming from the neighbors, and it's very, in the sense of drama, it's very interesting what's happening at night, and then the morning is coming out, and everything is changing. So this was actually one level that you have throughout the whole film, is the sound of my bedroom. The other level was going to Jaffa, and this was the only thing that I did in the place now, was going to many of these places that you see in the film, and I did recordings. Now, my idea was to do all the recordings at night and not during the day, because I had this idea that places at night free themselves from the present. So I would start 10 o'clock at night and finish like 4 in the morning, and walking around and do these recordings. And some of the recordings were actually attaching a mic to places and trying to hear what the places are hearing. And then step by step, the film was created with these sounds, basically with the idea that this is any place after catastrophe.
Yeah, I found it, funnily, it reminded me of an exhibition I lately saw at the Wallraf-Richartz-Museum, very small, simple exhibition about Palmyra with drawings from Palmyra from the late 19th century. And they were very abstract architectonic drawings, and there was the exhibition just showed these images, that was all. Yeah. And I really liked the gesture because it was a very abstract way to reconstruct or to also speak about a loss or something. And within your film I find it interesting that through the long period and or the long time, the long duration of the film, suddenly one realizes after some time one gets a mistrust that suddenly you understand, no, there's nobody walking around, and images reoccur, and there's a strange insecurity you get about the images, and they suddenly become very abstract. And I find it interesting that also this happens on, that you consciously did this decision also on a level of sound, like entering these sounds of the night, like, because then suddenly it's not only about what has been there, but also what you imagine and what is absent, something that is already absent in the images. you know, and I mean, because it says also about the image. I mean, it tells also about the absence within the images they are deriving from. They are like ghosts, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it was actually a fascinating process. I would say even scary, because the amount of people that I found in the background was incredible. I could find almost everything I needed to make a new film. Now, I mentioned before that these fiction films were they were very popular films. I would say cinematically speaking, they were very weak. And in the process itself, I quite disliked these films. But finally, when I finished my project, I realized actually I do like them because they made it possible for me to make my film. And they managed to capture what I couldn't, what I wasn't able to capture because I wasn't born when many of these films were made. So I started saying, yeah, I saw first face engraved in stone, and then I started seeing people who actually happened to pass by in the background of these films, and they were caught in these films. And slowly I had the idea that actually all these people in the background, they were waiting for me all these years to find them. And to film them and finally make a film with them, a film that no one made with them before. So this is something that happens to you while you're making a film. You start imagining things because, you know, when I was telling people about the idea of the film, they would tell me, okay, so you're gonna say all of this. I said, no, I want to make a film.
It's something that you also only can do in film. You know, there's this time
absolutely
about it. Yeah.
So it's very much about really the process of, I would say, showing the bottom of the ocean as it is,
yes,
and not try to describe it. You know, this is what it is. And I think cinema is old enough to be reused now. I mean, there are so many films already made, and if there is something that this film can say, that we can take any fiction film, and if we need to erase the actors, to remove them, and make a new film. We can do that with films shot in Berlin, we can do that with films shot in New York, and create a new narrative. And it's something that happens to you once you start making these films. You can imagine only making this type of films.
Okay.
I'm not saying I'm going to do this again because it was really a long process, you know, doing the whole erasure of characters and creating a new camera work in the background.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know how the situation is with Beirut. Is she? She's online. Okay, maybe we have time still for at least one question. Siegfried Zielinski has one, I know, but we can continue the discussion later on also.
Yes, perhaps. No, I'm just so working. I'm just so curious, Kamal, because you mentioned it very quickly, but this is for me aesthetically extremely extraordinary. I had the privilege perhaps to see these thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs which you were working with to make this film. What we are seeing now is a result. I know we have no time, so I'll make it very short. Where you took a lot away. And this is very interesting. From this gesture of décollage, from taking away things, you create something new out of the document, so to speak, from the past, which were filmed from the past. So this is a wonderful aesthetical gesture. You don't add something to create something new. You take away, and something fantastic, imaginary new is generated.
I mean, you know, one part was. Again, one of the things that I had to deal with, you know, you are not just an artist or filmmaker. People look at you as someone coming from Palestine, so you are supposed to do something. And people would tell me, yeah, you are creating an archive. I said, no. because, as I said before, my intention was really to work with cinema itself. It is a film making itself. So, of course, when you start with the process of making the images, as I mentioned before, I would project the films in a cinema. I had, this was during my residency at Harvard. I had the keys of the cinema at the Harvard Film Archive, and I could project the films and make the photos. So I spent the whole winter making these pictures. And I realized, yes, I mean, I managed to create a kind of archive, but a personal archive. This wasn't it wasn't my intention to create an archive of the city. And then I had to look at these and actually create new work out of these images. And I couldn't use all of them, obviously, because there were something like 25,000 different images that I made from the films. So it was a process inside the process that finally resulted in this film of working with images. And that's why I'm saying this is not an archival film, because I erased people, I added sometimes, because if you know a bit of the technology I used, sorry? Just a sentence. So in order to do what I did, the characters in the film, they have to move. So this was my big frustration all the time, that some of these characters, they would just stand, they wouldn't move. So I had to, I would erase them and then complete what was hidden behind them, meaning windows or houses or streets. So I had to imagine what was behind them. And this was something very enjoyable, because you realized that you could do so much. You could create a new space that you could basically live in. And this is the Adorno idea that I had in mind while making the film. Basically, what he once said, that for a writer who has no homeland, writing becomes a place to live. And in that sense, cinema is a place to live. Thank you.